Right. Welcome to the Hangout. Over to you, Janet.
Right, good evening and welcome to the second of our Hangouts on Air for our shared endeavour. And this hour or so we're going to be looking at the working environment, and I'll just call my slides up with a bit of luck. Here we go, yes. The built environment relating to work. And that actually my place is only tiny, it's only 12 houses. There aren't any places of work actually in my place itself, but the residents still work somewhere. And it's actually quite interesting to look at where they worked and the history of the companies, but also the history of the buildings that these residents did work in, and the ones that places that they shopped, that they got their gas and electricity from, and so on and so forth. So there's resources I've used are a mixture of both local and general guides. There's the general guide there as an industrial archaeology textbook, but some kind gentleman has done a series of booklets on the industrial heritage of virtually every factory, quarry, mine, industrial building in the whole area, and that's been incredibly useful. They're helpful, but they are only guides, and they're secondary sources, and they need to be checked out just like any other secondary source needs to be checked out. And there's been a sprouting locally of information boards, like the one in the bottom right-hand corner, which we'll come back to later on. And they've been put up at old industrial sites, and they're useful summaries, but again, they're only guides and they're not always accurate. And there was one near to the one that's on the map, on the slide, sorry, that supposedly showed locomotives and steam cranes building a reservoir, but the reservoir was actually built before locomotives and steam cranes were in common use. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, use them as a guide, but check it out. Going way, way back, my place was subject to forest law until 1507, and I don't think the king or the lord ever actually hunted here, and it was actually used for breeding cattle for oxen. And the local archaeology group has attempted to find and define the summer and the winter pastures for the various vaccaries, the various cow farms that were existing in the area. And one of them was thought to be above Spring Hill, but nothing actually remains to be seen there except a relatively good quality field. But the stone walling, the kind of slab stone walling, is still known locally as Vaccary walling, although most of it is in 17th century. And the example on the right with the trees is actually on a lane in Spring Hill. That's a local one. The other one is up the hill across the valley. Spring Hill will be sort of behind the trees and behind the houses on that one. So we don't have any direct 16th century slab paving walling, but the tradition has remained in the naming that of the technique that was used then. And because cattle farming didn't earn people a fortune, it was supplanted by domestic weaving. And this was done in the home, just in the place where the people lived. And initially there were no particular special features in order to do that. And that's a mock-up from a local heritage museum showing family spinning and then father upstairs by an open window to get as much light as possible doing the handloom weaving. And they were just domestic industries that would occur in the house. And eventually there will be the development of weavers' cottages, and this is quite a large example. And some of the features that will have, I'll show you the other side of it. If you notice, the top floor has more and bigger windows than the first and second floors. And the first and second floors will be 3 or 4 cottages, and the top floor would be shared going across the whole size of the cottages, and that will be where the looms were. And going back to that one, that's back in front of the same building, that you can see on the right-hand side the stairs going up to the upstairs door to allow the people who did the weaving to go in and out, without disturbing the families below. This is said to be an 18th century example and is quite a good one. So as we said, there's two or four dwellings. I think some of the flats at one stage. And the top floors were open to make room for the looms. And it's said that there were 12 or so looms that were in that size, which is about the size of two decent terraced houses. And a rather less fine example is actually in Spring Hill itself. It's less notable than that one has been preserved by the local civic trust. This one hasn't. But again, you've got the differences between the upper and the lower floor windows. And you've got more windows and bigger windows in the upper floors than you have downstairs. And that again was originally two dwellings that has been knocked through to form a single house. And actually one of my ancestors lived in the bottom one of those in the late 19th century, but that's another story. So that was the domestic spinning and weaving industry, but then came the Industrial Revolution from the mid-18th century onwards. And that's just a list of some of the key inventions and the times that they were either known to have been commenced or that they were patented. Cotton is actually first recorded in the local area in the 1770s. And of course it would take a while for the machines to go from being patented to being produced to being installed in factories and used on a commercial basis. But the new machines were much more suited to cotton than they were to wool. And the increased ease of importing increased the availability of cotton locally. And that led to the emergence of a number of local capitalists in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they had direct connections to the overseas cotton markets. So you've got farmer weaver, farmer capitalist, and then manufacturers going through from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th and into the 19th centuries. But of course these machines were relatively big. The power looms required more cotton than the domestic spinners could spin, but they could also weave cotton at cheaper prices than the hand loom weavers could. And that led to poverty amongst the hand loom weavers as they were being undercut by the manufactured cotton into the mills. You have these big machines that are too big for domestic dwellings. That led to the growth of the mill, and we'll come back to the mill because that's a big feature locally. But the buildings, the hand loom weavers' cottages that we showed earlier would revert to dwellings. The upper floor would be converted back into the house, subdivided and incorporated back into the house. And eventually many of them were demolished, which is one reason why the Civic Trust got hold of one and preserved it. The growth of the mill, as I said, also led to poverty amongst the hand loom weavers because they were being undercut by the mass-produced stuff. And that led to hand loom weavers' riots in various areas, including about a quarter of a mile from here in 1826, where gangs of hand loom weavers would go from mill to mill, smashing the looms, and I think there was actually a murder in one place about 4 or 5 miles away from here. So there's a lot of social unrest as the mills developed. So the mill itself, well, the local area was very suited to mill development. It's not good land, so you can't grow anything. It will support a few cattle or a few sheep, but it won't grow anything arable. And I apologise, I think we're going to be joined by a cat. No. Come on, please. So the location was ideally suited to mill development. You can't grow anything. There's nothing arable, certainly. But there's fast running water. There's a lot of water in the air. There's coal and stone locally available. And transport connections were being developed around about that time as well. We don't have a canal, But the road was turnpiked in the late 18th century, and the railway came in the second quarter of the 19th. And that included improved transport rapidly, and we'll come later on to how some of those were related to each other, particularly the mills and the railways. And different mills were there for different purposes, and they have different features. And those who are experts on industrial archaeology, and I'm not particularly, can relate the different features from the different mills, and the rest of us can learn from that. So as I said, there was a lot of water power, and a lot of the mills were originally done by water wheels, and that's a picture from one of the local spinning mills that's actually been preserved as a museum. And the water wheel pits may survive when the mill itself is gone. So you may just see a big hole in the ground next to the river, or a little diversion, the part where the river has been diverted, and it goes in parallel to the main flow of the river and then rejoins later on. And that may be the remnant of a water wheel for a mill that has long since gone. Later, of course, steam engines replaced the water wheels. You could get steam when you didn't necessarily have a full river. And they would draw water from mill lodges. And again, the lodges often survive when the mill is gone. And there's many, many places around here where you will come across a small lake in the middle of a field or by the side of a road and think, what's that doing there? And there was a mill next to it that is now long gone and been replaced with something else, but the lodge has survived.
So is it, by lodge, you mean, is that the little lake you're talking
little
about?
Lakes that supply the waters, yeah, little mill lakes. Some of them are quite big actually as well, and they may survive as a lake, or they may have been grown over, and because they're still damper than the areas around them, and because they've been invaded in with different plants to those of the surrounding field, you may have a field or something, and then an area of round-ish shape that has a completely different vegetation pattern to the rest of the field. I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of that, but so you used to look at this bit and think, I wonder why that bit's not the same as the rest of it, and it's because it's an old lake that's been grown over rather than part of the original field itself. And we see those quite a lot, and there's loads of these little lakes, little lodges scattered all over the countryside. Oops. So first part of the cotton process was spinning, and it would actually cover the whole process from raw to spun cotton, raw cotton to spun cotton. And these could be quite big mills. They'd be up to 6, 8 floors, and you do one job on one floor and then put it up to another one floor and do another job on one floor and work them out that way. That is a picture of an old spinning mill about half a mile from here, and again this was built in 1856, and at its height it had 40,000 spindles and about 750 looms, something like that, and it's actually pretty much intact. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories, L-shaped. There's an engine chamber in one corner with its own warehouse. And it is adjacent to the now beachinged railway line and had its own private siding. So as the railways were being put in, various industrialists would say, well, if I buy this land and put a mill here, will you put me a siding in? And they'd pay to have a siding put in so that they could just spin, load, and off it goes. And that cut down, of course, on their transportation costs enormously. And there's a few examples of those throughout the way of the along the railway line. That's a picture of one of the carding sheds in the museum, the Heritage Museum I spoke about earlier. That museum was a working mill that was shut, and it was left as it was when it was shut and turned directly into a museum, so it's not being restored. It still has 1970s health and safety posters on the wall, and things like that, which I find absolutely fascinating. But again, you get an idea there of just the sheer size of the machinery and the complexity of it, and the amount of space that would be needed to house these devices. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what process that relates to, but again, it gives you the size. There's huge machinery, so there's huge mills, large windows to try and bring in as much natural light as possible. But they were also gaslit when it wasn't daylight until electricity came in. And of course, there was always a fire risk. And then there was numerous mills that burnt down and were rebuilt and burnt down and were rebuilt, and had that cycle going round. And that's a picture of some of the steam engines and the pressure valves and some of the just miscellaneous equipment that was needed to run the mill as opposed to actually done the spinning and the cotton. The top right is a stationary engine called Peace, which a lot of them were actually. The bottom right is the valves associated with that, and the left one is just a system of pulleys designed to get the output of the engine to move all the cranks and shafts to drive the machinery. And those remnants may survive as well. They may survive in situ, they may survive in the museums. And particularly things that are stuck on walls are often still stuck on the walls if people can get into the property to see them. That's a picture of the spinning shed with the looms coming out. And again, as you can see, the thing on the left of the mural in the centre of the picture, the thing on the left would pull out towards the right, and the one on the opposite side would pull out towards the left. We're leaving them about a foot, about 3 feet in the centre, 2 feet in the centre to walk and work in. And again, it just shows something of the size of the buildings that will be needed to actually do the job. So that's the spinning and the carding process from fleece to spun cotton. They would then go to the weaving, and the weaving sheds were often of a completely different nature. And they would have this, they'd usually be single story. And if you can see there, they have like a corrugated roof pattern. So you can see a kind of stripy appearance on the roof. And they would be slanted roofs. The dark side would be brick, and the light side facing to the top left of that picture would be glass. And by staggering it, corrugating it a bit like that, would increase the amount of natural light that comes in to try and maximise the vision for the weavers. And that's an idea of the inside of it, and that's just row after row after row of looms. And you can get some idea again of the complexity of the pulleys and the belts that would connect these looms to the stationary engine that we showed you earlier. And getting caught up in those pulleys was a constant risk, and the papers are full of reports into incidents of unfortunate accident for Joe Bloggs, who got his jacket caught in the pulley and smashed his head against the rotator at the top. So they're usually single story. They may be partially underground, which is damper, and of course the cotton's less likely to break if it's damp, which is one reason why it does so well in Rawtenstall, because it's very damp up here. And they have stone floors, which reduce the vibration from all those looms clattering around. And again, the stone floors will often have survived when the rest of the mill has gone. And that might be one of the remnants for what's still there. That would then go off to be dyed and printed. And as I was growing up, we were about quarter of a mile away from a dyeing mill, and you could always tell what colours they'd been using in the dyeing process by what colour the river was coming down the hill. And, oh, it's purple
That's
today.
another great look.
No, it wasn't marvellous. Oh, it's blue today. But of course, so me growing up, a river changing colour was a perfectly natural thing. And it was a while before I realised, age about 5 or 6, that not all rivers change colour on a regular basis. Just weird. Anyway, And that gives an idea. Each of those dots would be a mill in the local area within about 2 miles. Sprinkle is almost bang in the middle of that. Can you see the cursor on the screen or not?
Yes, yes.
Yes, you can. Sprinkle will be right there.
Yeah.
And that would be about a 2 mile radius. So within 50 years or so of these inventions, it just shows the impact and the development of these mills, the effect on the handloom weavers we mentioned earlier, but also the impact on the landscape. And this is only 1844. Another 100 years, there'll be as many again and a few. So there was mill after mill after mill after mill, and it just completely transformed the local environment, the local landscape. And that gives some idea of how it looked. As it's a valley, it's a series of river valleys. The mills were concentrated on the valley floor, with better class housing above that, and then green fields above that. So although you had all the smoke coming out of the chimneys on the valley floor and it would hang in the valley, it wasn't quite as oppressive as it was in some towns where you had more of a sort of circular or splodge thing. And in some parts of that, you really could just see mill after mill after mill after mill. At least within about a mile of there would be green fields and people could get out and explore. So, of course, mills have workers, and workers need somewhere to live. And we're not going to concentrate on housing particularly because we did that last time. But the mill owners will build houses for their workers, and they would quite often name the streets after the mill. So you'd have Isle of Man Mill and Isle of Man Street, and one that I think is desperately misnamed, Paradise Mill and Paradise Street. Not my idea of paradise, but never mind. And these were small, one up, one down, later 2 up, 2 down, back-to-backs. But they were generally locally of a reasonably decent standard. They had stone floors, outside privies, and were close together and under the shadow of the mill. And you can see on that picture, you've got the mill at the end of the street and then all the houses coming up alongside it. But although by our standards they were not good, they were often better than the houses that the people had lived in before. So to some people, to some extent, it might have been an improvement. We don't have any model villages locally, but there were the philanthropic mill owners who built them. Bourneville, Port Sunlight, Saltaire, places like that. We don't actually have one of those. And as well as housing, some mill owners actually built facilities for their workers. Gaggil's was the slipper mill, and it had a bowling green for its employees. And the mill has gone. The mill went 20 odd years ago. The building's down, but the bowling green survived. And there's still a bowling club that meets there and uses it. So again, some of the associated facilities may survive long after the mill itself is actually gone. And that green's still in use. And then the mill owners had houses as well, and their houses were slightly more salubrious than the ones that they built for their workers. But that too will overlook the mill, although at some distance and with a slightly better view. Yeah, it's very nice. It's now a museum. And if you can see in the bottom just to the right of centre there is the chimney of the mill that this owner built. And they quite often lived on the hillsides and lived quite close to the mills that they owned. There were other industries and similar principles applied, and many mills would house a range of industries over the years. So something might start off as a spinning mill, and then that company went bust, but the mill was still there and it would be bought by somebody else who'd use it as a felt mill. And then they would get bust, but the mill was still there, so it'd be bought by somebody else who went back to spinning or possibly to footwear and so on and so forth. So that the same mill will be adapted over the years. So Lancashire has no textile industry anymore, so what's happened to them? Well, most were abandoned and fell into disrepair. And that's Laura Mill in the centre of town. and was actually reasonably good nick at the time it was pulled down. But the site remained vacant and derelict for many years and is now that. It's an Asda. So development may not always necessarily be progress. I think that's a hideous sight, to be quite honest, but there you go. Some of them are turned into des reses and can fetch nice prices. And that is the front of the mill that we saw earlier on when I was saying about the siding onto the railway line. That's the other side of it. That's the same chimney that we saw earlier. And some of them have been restored quite sensitively, and they can either be housings or they can be as units. And that's flats with a nice view of the cricket field. They can be turned into museums, and I mentioned about the place that had been closed and then left as it was. Well, that's the picture of that mill. And it has a sister mill as a weaving mill that was also turned into a similar museum. And some of them are just ruined. And they're still there, and they're still ruined. So most of the industry around here was either textiles or footwear, and most of that was done by the mill system. But that in itself needs a supporting infrastructure, and we'll cover this a bit more later in the year. But these places, the utilities, the gas, the electricity places, the people who ran the reservoirs, the sewage works, the transports, the quarries, the miners, they were all people's workplaces as well. So a bit about mining, because one of my residents was a colliery proprietor, and that can influence a place, even if it's not actually. Sorry, that somebody who lives in a place. Start again. Somebody who lived in Spring Hill can influence a place somewhere else, even if he's not physically present there. So Ashworth had a big effect on the local landscape in many ways, not because he actually lived in any of them, but because his company ran mines in them all. And that's one of his collieries about 3 miles north of here. And that's it in the late 19th century. And that's it today. The top is the boiler house. The bottom is the engine. Bottom left is the engine house with the engine beds, and the bottom right is the pumping house, which is still functional. The site is now a reservoir, and the pumping house is used to adjust the flows in the reservoir from time to time. And for some bizarre reason I've never quite understood, in the middle of all this is an open-air baptistry. And I have no idea why, but that's where it is. So why people were being baptised on the hill in the middle of a mile, middle of a mine, I have absolutely no idea. There you go. And that's the map we saw earlier. Remains like this often come with information boards, and remember that they may or may not be accurate. And that is the information board that's pertaining to that set of mine works. That the rest of that is now pretty much all reservoir. That's the view from the scrubbing mill of the stone quarry, about a mile from Spring Hill. Spring Hill will be about there on the other side of the valley. And you can see there's quite a lot of lasting effect on the landscape. And that's all very well, but what do the pieces represent? And of course you can see also we've got an information board. And that's what the information board tells us. So as we've already said, they may not always be helpful. But there you go. But rather more reliable are things like that, which are the OS maps of the period. That one was 1908. The item labelled tramway here is that there. And it disappears off the side of the valley and goes quite steeply down the hillside. And it was one of these tramways on a loop where the weight of the full carriages will pull the empty ones back up again. But the showing of works on the old maps gives you some idea of at least what was the where And if you're lucky enough, it was labelled and you can work out what they are actually for. So that's all I was planning to say about buildings and the built environment as relates to what we have in my place. Others will have different things in different places. So hopefully some people will have come out of the picture. Some people will have other industries and therefore other types of built environment to share with.
Right, I'm changing it so whoever speaks will be seen.
Okay, right. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that, Peter.
Oh, thank you for the presentation.
You're very welcome. How does that relate to your place? Go on.
It takes me back home because I was brought up in Yorkshire, so lots of mills around, but not at all around here. I'll let Alex talk. Alex, you've got...
I've got a quite different situation because I know that you said in your area the land wasn't good for growing anything at all, whereas Wing is an agricultural area, rural village. So farming was probably the main employer in the area. But of course, we're focusing on buildings, not on land.
Yes, true.
Yeah.
But although the quality of the land is one of the things that leads to those buildings being where they are.
Exactly.
If our land had been better, we would have had a different set of structures built upon it.
Yeah. So we do see the kind of traditional things you often see in formerly rural villages where the barns of the farms are suddenly getting converted into beautiful new housing areas. And there's certainly a lot of that seems to have popped up over the last 5 years or so. I've been noticing because I watched the real estate ads for properties in Wing in the area, and I've noticed, the barn conversions are coming in thick and fast over the last 5 years or so. So that's what's happening to some of those buildings there.
Is it just barns, or do you have like the old cotton mill or horse houses and?
No, we don't have any of that.
Corn mill, not cotton mill. I've got cotton on the brain.
Yeah. No, there really isn't anything interesting like that. One other industry which again didn't lend itself to creating a particular type of building was straw plaiting.
It's what, sorry?
Straw plaiting.
Oh, yeah.
Where the women of the village would plait the straw to then be made into the straw hats and whatnot. But of course, that was something that was done from within the home. Yeah. Or apparently you could wander around chatting to your mates doing it, wander around the village with people. So again, that didn't lend itself to buildings either particularly well. We did have the odd mill. So we had a water mill, so it was interesting to hear you talk about the water mills and what to look for there. And our mills were for milling the corn and whatnot.
Yeah.
That was getting grown in the immediate area. Yeah. So.
Is there anything remaining from that water mill?
The mill lodge is there. Because I can't physically go and have a poke around, I'm not sure how boggy the area might be. I'm not sure what else there might be. That particular one is still standing. Most of the other mills aren't. There was a windmill in the late 1700s. It was taken down by about 1800. Yeah. And a corn mill, which is sort of more within the housing of the village, which would just be housing now. Although there is a street, tiny weeny street called Corn Mill Close. Yeah.
Yeah, we have coal pit lane that doesn't have a coal pit at the end of it now. It's the other way in which industry survives, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting you're saying about the windmills, because I'm not aware of any historic windmills in my place, but within about 1.5 miles of us now is the largest onshore wind farm in the UK, that can be seen for miles around. And so we have them now.
Got the wind. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the wind, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But
I wonder if there was something and you just don't know about it yet.
Quite possibly.
They must have ground corn somewhere locally somehow. But if you've got running water, maybe they use that somehow.
Or all the oxen from these vaccaries, I don't know. Yeah. But
I mean, my place is very much just a self-contained village. Not now, but it used to be. So we've got everything here in terms of at the different points. We've got the various mills, and we've got a brewery, and there was a big industry of orchards and fruit farming. So not more barns for storing fruit in the 19th century. But otherwise, most of the I was just trying to think about it. The actual buildings relating to work were, the wheelwright shop and the saddlery and the. In fact, our little local history group, our last meeting was in a local house that used to be the baker's. So we had a look around the house, and they showed us the old oven that was still there, although she uses it for storing clothes now, so we didn't look too closely. But it was interesting seeing the old photos of the big chimneys and things for that. But it's all very local, diverse and very not a lot to see.
Not industrial per se. It's for just employing 1, 2, 3 people, the family.
Yeah, that's right. It's all
provide that particular service for the village. Yeah, that's the sort of scenario I have in mind.
Yeah.
And did it remain self-contained when we started to develop gas and electric power, or were they brought in from outside?
Well, we were. I don't know how. We weren't very self-contained in the sense that there's a town a mile and a half away, St Ives, so there was always trading with it, and that was a big market in the 13th century. So there's a lot I don't know about it, but there was certainly regular contact with that. But generally speaking, it's an agricultural society here, and self-contained in terms of the trades.
Yeah. And what other? And I've talked a lot about mills because that's what we have. But are there any other work environments that have left their mark in terms of buildings? Not so much locally, but if they're closing all these House of Fraser stores in the UK, and there's lots of shop closures and things like that, then that's going to lead to empty properties that will be redeveloped for other purposes or pulled down.
There are I do have quite a lot of questions, basically thousands of questions about my village, and 1 or 2 of them are about why is that particular building, why does it have that beam there? It looks like it maybe was a bigger window than that. So what was that about? So there's all sorts of questions I've got, but very few answers about it. And there's I think there's 2 buildings that look to me like they might have been part of an inn.
Right.
And the gap between them is like, I could imagine a coach and horses going through from the turnpike. So I've got imaginings about that, and I know there was an inn in that very area, so it's probably that, but I don't know.
Is Wing reasonably flat, Alex?
The village housing area is reasonably flat, and then sort of gently undulating away.
Yeah.
Hills on one side.
Because we're in the fringes of the West Pennine Moors, which of course isn't. And when Peter was saying about the inns, we have therefore a lot of inns that are built on the top of the moors so that you could rest the horses. And they're still there. And now, of course, nobody lives there and you can't drive. And a lot of those have either closed and turned into rest homes or such like. Or they've been converted into restaurants, and they're basically places where you eat with a license rather than places where you would go and drink, and certainly not where you would go and stay anymore. But
the view.
Oh yes, beautiful. But in the middle of nowhere, on the top of a moor, you'll find this pub, and that'll be a leftover from the horse trade, the horse transport.
One of the things our little history group have talked about doing maybe one time, because last year we did a walk and open to lots of people about our fire that destroyed lots of houses. The next walk I want to do is basically a pub crawl, going to all the 20 buildings we know were pubs in the village at one point or another. So
that's interesting. And how many still are?
Well, no, only
not enough to cause damage.
No. Yeah, unless we join up with the local beer and wine society, but I don't know that we'll do that. I think there are 3 that are, if you include Holywell, which is part of the same parish, there are 3 pubs still in existence. Although most of the buildings of these old pubs are still there, and you can see various things that help you to see they were pubs. You know, an old sign or a window, which obviously they used to raise the barrels up into, or a cellar or something. There's various things you can see.
Yeah. Yes, there's
now I want to get into Wing and have a good poke around the back of my pubs and see what I can see in the buildings. I've only got, photos, modern day photos of the front in most cases, or, old postcards of them from the front.
I must admit that one of the things that I've really enjoyed doing in the village, because I live in it, and I've prepared these walks. I've got 4 or 5 walks I can do, and I want to do 2 or 3 more. To do them, I've basically wandered around and stopped and looked, and just spending 5 or 10 minutes looking at the brickwork on a particular building. I can see things, and I wouldn't have noticed just passing. Yes. And I've seen, different things that. And I've asked people, and even the person that lived there didn't know about it. And, just fascinating. I know nothing about architecture or anything like that, but just looking and seeing and asking the question, why is that house in the terrace slightly bigger than the others?
And one of the common remnants from the handloom weavers' cottages that I was mentioning earlier is what looks like a door, but on the 2nd or the 3rd floor. And that would quite often have the remnants of a pulley adjacent to it that will be used for lifting up the raw materials and getting them up and down. And so when you see a door 15 feet up in the air and think, what's that doing there? Then that's quite often the reason why. This, as you say, the little changes. Why is that like that? Why is that window bricked up and that door there? Did it used to be a shop, for example? Changes in brickwork and things like that. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of walks around villages, something I haven't been able to do because I'm here and Wing is there.
Sorry about that.
One of the farms in the area was taken over and used as an RAF airfield during World War II. And I know the local history group did do a walk out there one day, examining the buildings and things. And some of those buildings were converted for use by the RAF and then haven't been touched since. So it asked if
really
falling down and overgrown and whatnot. So that would be really interesting to go and see. But it's an example.
There is actually a website that I found, because we've got a building a bit like that. It was used by military research, and it's a derelict now. And I found a mention of it on a website from some young chaps whose hobby is to go into these old places and sort of film inside, probably illegally. But it's fascinating to see, they're exploring the inside of these buildings. I shouldn't encourage it, but
like the urban exploration things.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yes, I've got mixed feelings on that, because I have my doubts about the practice, but some of the things that they have come up with are quite interesting.
Yeah.
And if we're not going in and sort of recording what it looks like at any given point in time, you don't miss that opportunity. So.
Yeah. It's yes, I've got. I don't know them personally, but I've got links with a group locally that do that, who've given me permission to use their photos as long as they're acknowledged, and that's very adds an extra dimension to it, certainly. Yeah. So, do you find things are recycled from one work building to another.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, I've actually got some bricks in my garden from a chapel that was torn down with permission. Now that's a minor thing, but certainly there were. Our church has got stones in its tower from the dissolution of the local monastery. That's not industrial, I know, but
no. I think for ours it's more the building itself that's been reused, and I'm sure that there's a lot of good quality stone that's been in these mills that's been pulled down, that's now in various houses and properties around the place, but I don't know where they are. It's kind of very difficult to trace that kind of stuff.
My parents lived for 25 years in an old mill that had been changed into a very nice development of 20 houses down by the river. It's very nice in Yorkshire. Well, like
the one we showed next to the cricket field.
Yeah.
That's been sensitively done.
This was actually houses, nicely done, and the mill lead or whatever it is went under the one, so it's you could see it actually running. And
the corn mill I mentioned earlier, some of the millstones from that. The mill itself was on Church Street, and some of the millstones actually now form part of the path leading up to All Saints Church.
Oh, so the actual grinding stones.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
that's interesting. And the other thing I haven't touched, of course, is retail buildings. There are places where people work as well. You'd have the cooperatives and the markets. We've got market stalls, market stands. And then shops, most often of which ours will have be lock-ups and have flats above them. And then turning down to the out-of-town developments and supermarkets, and then back to small units in the town centre again, and how it ebbs and flows. Sorry, Peter, you were going to say something.
Yeah, most buildings you could look at as where somebody worked, because many of the posher houses would have had domestic servants, so that was the house they lived in, that was the house they worked in, and obviously the pub and the church, the rector worked there. So
yeah, that's true. Good.
Well, we're sort of wing, I imagine, quite like mine, in the sense that we don't have the overarching mill industry, so it's very different from yours. So it's been very interesting hearing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd say I had to stretch it a bit, because as I say, Spring Hill's only 12 houses, and none of them are industrial as such. And there are a few people who work from home, but that's scarcely the same. And as far as I know, nobody's got any domestic servants at the moment, although they certainly did have in the past. Ashworth, with the colliery proprietor we mentioned earlier, certainly had a few. And until relatively recently, there was a farm round the back that shut in the early 1980s, I think.
Because if you did
converted to des resis too. Sorry, go on.
If you do a little survey now in our village of home industries, there's actually quite a lot of them. I know a lady who does upholstery at home. There's a lady who repurposes furniture. There's somebody who all these little craft industries. There's people working on computers at home. There's a lot happening now in homes.
Yes, we have a neighbour who I used to have a neighbour who sells kits for making teddy bears.
Oh yeah.
I don't think she got enough to live off on it, but it was a nice little supplement,
Yeah.
And everything you need to make this bear or that bear, and catalogue would go out and the orders would come in, and there you go.
Right. Well, we're probably there's only the three of us, so we're come to the end of that, I think. What's the next section of your shared endeavour is supporting infrastructure, is it?
Yeah, community and municipal buildings.
So
the town hall. Sorry, go on.
Unsexy stuff like municipal buildings and the sexier stuff like recreational facilities and whatnot. So yeah, anything there for the wider benefit of the community.
I think it's unsexy stuff, but the history behind our
Are you
town
gonna
hall
surprise
buildings. Well, I won't quite say sex.
My wife and I.
But the history behind our town hall buildings and why they are where they are is quite interesting and illustrates the ability of our council not to do any forward planning, but that's another matter.
Our council is planning to move totally. Cambridgeshire County Council is planning to move its offices quite a long way away onto an old airfield. And other councillors are saying, why are you doing it? Because we're under threat of being dissolved. But they're trying to plan ahead. Anyway, that's by the by.
But I'll save that one till next quarter. But yes, municipal and community buildings, community halls, leisure centres, the pub. The pub can come under there. In our place, it will be things like mechanics institutes and libraries. And
where I lived in Bermondsey for a while, of course, we had the local baths where everybody went on a Friday to have their bath.
Yes.
And anyway, okay, lovely.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.